The sky above Valara Prime burned with dying light as another defense platform exploded in silent fury against the black of Space Commander. Thesic stood at the observation window of the planetary command center and watched her world's last hope crumble into debris and fire. Her forearms hung loose at her sides, and her antennae drooped forward in the Velaran gesture of ultimate defeat around her. The command staff worked in desperate silence, and their chittering voices had grown quiet as the reality of their situation became undeniable. The Krath Imperium had come to Valara like a plague and consumed 12 star systems before reaching this peaceful world. The Krath did not negotiate and did not accept surrender that left populations alive. They wanted resources and territory, and they viewed other species as obstacles to be removed with clinical efficiency. Thesic had studied the reports from fallen worlds and knew exactly what waited for her people once the Krath warships finished. With the orbital defenses, 6 massive Krath dreadnoughts hung in high orbit like predatory birds and their weapons. It's been methodically destroying every satellite and station and platform that Valara had built over 3 centuries of peaceful development. The Valaran defense fleet had lasted less than 4 hours against the Krath are modeled now. The orbital space belonged to the enemy, and nothing stood between the Krath and planetary invasion, except time. The Sec turned from the window and walked to the central command table, where holographic displays showed the tactical situation in cruel detail. Her second officer, Venkus, looked up at her with all 4 eyes dim with exhaustion and asked the question that everyone in the room was thinking. Should we begin evacuation protocols, Commander? Thesic's mandibles clicked together in bitter amusement, because everyone knew there was nowhere to evacuate. The nearest allied world was 8 light years away, and Valara had perhaps 6 hours before Krath troop carriers began their descent. The Confederation fleet was engaged in desperate battles across 4 sectors and could not reach Valara for at least 2 weeks. By then there would be nothing left to save except radioactive ruins and mass graves. Send one final distress signal on all frequencies. Thesic said quietly. Include our historical records and cultural database. And if the Krath destroy us, perhaps someone will remember that Valara existed. Venkus began working at his console, and his movements carried the careful precision of someone performing a funeral. Rita Thesic watched the holographic display and saw Krath troop carriers beginning to detach from the dreadnoughts. The invasion would begin within the hour. She thought about her mate and their larvae in the southern continent city of Kethra, and wondered if she would ever see them again. The command center had become a tomb of living ghosts, and everyone present knew they were watching the final chapter of their civilization. A young communications officer named Prisk suddenly jerked upright at her station, and her antennae shot forward in surprise. Commander, I'm detecting a massive gravitic disturbance at the system's edge. Thesic felt a flutter of hope that died almost instantly because no friendly fleet could arrive. This quickly Krath reinforcements? She asked. Flatly. Prisk's hands moved rapidly across her controls, and her voice carried confusion rather than fear. Negative, Commander. And the signature doesn't match any known Krath vessel configuration, and I'm reading multiple contacts and they're moving fast and very fast. The holographic display updated and showed dozens of new contacts appearing at the edge of the Valara systems. The ships were smaller than Krath dreadnoughts, but they moved with purpose and speed that made the Krath vessels look sluggish by comparison. Stared at the display and felt her primary heart begin to race. Identification, she demanded. Prisk worked frantically at her console, and her voice emerged, small and disbelieving. Commander, and the transponder codes are ancient, and I had to search the historical archives, and these ships are registered too. And to Earth the command center fell. Absolutely silent. Earth was a name from old treaties and dusty diplomatic files. Humans were a young species that most of the galaxy had dismissed as too aggressive and too violent and too primitive to matter in galactic affairs. They were Deathworlders, from a planet that seemed designed to produce survivors, and their own history was soaked in warfare and conflict. Confederation had placed humanity under protective observation centuries ago and bound them with mutual defense treaties that everyone understood as symbolic gestures meant to contain rather than empower Valara. It's been one of only 7 species to vote in favor of humanity's conditional membership in the galactic community. Had been 200 years. Agathesic had never expected anyone to honor those ancient treaties, and certainly not a species that most galactic powers viewed with suspicion and unease. "Are they responding to our distress signal?" Vesic asked. Prisk nodded, and her antennae trembled. "Yes, Commander. And they're transmitting on emergency frequencies, and the message is simple." She played the audio, and a rough human voice filled the command center, speaking in heavily accented but understandable. "Galactic Standard Valoran Forces, this is Rear Admiral Chen of the Earth Defense Fleet, 3rd Expeditionary Group, and we received your distress call, and we remember our treaty obligations and hold your positions because humanity does not abandon its friends, and we are coming." Vesic felt something she had not felt in days, and the emotion was so foreign that it took her a moment to recognize it as hope round her. The command staff began to stir, and their antennae lifted, and their eyes, brightened Venki's, looked at Vesic with desperate optimism. "Commander, should we believe this? And can they really help us?" Vesic watched the human fleet accelerate toward Valara and saw the Krath dreadnoughts beginning to reorient to face this unexpected threat. The human ships were outnumbered and outmassed, and any reasonable tactical analysis would suggest they were about to be destroyed. But something in the way those ships moved, and something in the tone of that human admiral's voice made Vesic think that reasonable tactical analysis might not apply to humanity. "I don't know if they can save us," Vesic said slowly, "but they came when no one else would, and that counts for something." She straightened her posture, and her voice took on the command authority that had been absent for hours. "All defense batteries prepare to support the human fleet, and all ground forces move to defensive positions, and if Earth is willing to bleed for Valara, then we will not disgrace that sacrifice with cowardice." The command center erupted into activity. As her staff threw themselves into their duties with renewed purpose, the holographic display, the human fleet, continued its approach, and the Krath dreadnoughts opened. Vesic watched human ships dodge and weave through Krath weapons fire with impossible precision. Then the human fleet did something that made Vesic's breath catch. Instead of engaging the Krath fleet in orbital combat, the human ships dove straight toward the planet's atmosphere. Hundreds of objects began separating from the human vessels, and Vesic realized with shock that they were drop pods. Humans weren't preparing for a naval battle. They were preparing for planetary invasion. The Krath-occupied landing zones. The communications officer Prisk looked at Vesic with wide eyes. "Commander, and the humans are dropping troops directly into combat zones, and I've never seen this tactic before." Vesic watched the drop pods streak through Valara's atmosphere like falling stars. Each pod left a trail of fire across the darkening sky, and they fell toward the continents where Krath forces were already establishing beachheads. "Neither have I," Vesic said quietly. "Neither has anyone." She thought about the human message and about species that came from death worlds, and about warriors who would cross the galaxy to honor a 200-year-old treaty. Hope was a fragile thing, but as Vesic watched those burning stars fall from her sky, she allowed herself to feel it. The drop pod screamed through Valara's atmosphere, and inside, Sergeant Maria Okonkwo counted seconds and controlled her breathing like she'd been trained. The pod shook and rattled, and the heat shields glowed cherry red outside the reinforced viewports around her. The other 11 members of her squad sat strapped into their crash harnesses, and their armored forms looked almost relaxed, despite the violent descent. Had done this before on training worlds and hostile moons and pirate stations across human space. Dropping from orbit into a hot combat zone was just another day in the Earth Defense Force. The altimeter in Maria's helmet display counted down rapidly, and at 200 meters the retro rockets fired. The pod slammed into the ground with bond-enduring force, and the front panel exploded outward in a shower of explosive bolts. Maria hit the quick release on her harness and was moving before the dust settled. Her squad flowed out of the pod like water and spread into tactical formation with the automatic precision of dozens of combat drops. The landing zone was Chowkrath. Troop carriers had established a beachhead in what had been a Valoran agricultural district, and the insectoid aliens were deploying in rigid formation patterns. Maria's tactical display painted 37 Krath soldiers in red and showed the positions of other human squads landing across the combat zone. The Krath noticed the human drop pods and began reorienting their formation. moved with mechanical precision, and their weapons came up in unified voice. Maria grinned. Inside her helmet, because the Krath were doing exactly what the intelligence briefings had predicted, they thought like machines and followed doctrine, and expected their enemies to do the same. Humans did not follow doctrine. Light them up. Maria ordered, and her squad opened fire. The Krath had armor that could withstand most standard galactic weapons, but human weapons had been designed on a world where everything was trying to kill. Youth railgun rounds punched through Krath armor like paper, and the aliens' precise formation dissolved into chaos as soldiers dropped butt. The Krath were not cowards, and they returned fire with directed energy weapons. Beams cut through the air, and one of Maria's soldiers went down with a smoking hole in his shoulder. Plate medic, Maria called, and then she was moving. The rest of the galaxy fought battles with honor and formation tactics, and carefully calculated exchanges of fire. Humans had learned warfare in jungle ambushes and urban ruins and trench lines where nothing mattered except survival. Maria's squad scattered and used the broken terrain for cover. They moved and fired and moved again, and never stayed in one position long enough for the Krath to target. Effectively, a Krath officer tried to rally his troops into a defensive square, and Maria put 3 rounds through his center. Masweth, out their officer. The Krath soldiers hesitated, and in that moment of confusion, two more human squads hit them from the flanks. The Krath line collapsed. Maria's tactical displays showed similar scenes playing out across the landing zone. Human forces were outnumbered 3-1, but they were winning through speed and aggression and tactics that the Krath had never encountered. A voice crackled in Maria's helmet, and it spoke in stilted galactic standard. Human soldiers, this is Commander Desic of Velaran Planetary Defense, and we have forces trapped in Sector 7, and can you assist? Maria checked her tactical display and saw the Velaran position. A group of indigenous defenders had been surrounded by Krath forces and were being slowly overwhelmed. Copy that, Commander, Maria replied. In her rough galactic standard, we're on our way. She switched to her squad channel and gave rapid orders in English. Her team moved out, and they covered 3 kilometers in 15 minutes through terrain that should have taken an hour to cross. The Krath had learned to build fortifications against enemies who attacked from expected angles. They had not learned to defend against enemies who approached from everywhere, and nowhere. Maria's squad hit the Krath encirclement from behind and used grenades and suppressing fire to break their formation. The trapped Velaran forces seized the opportunity and pushed outward. Maria saw her first Velaran up close and was struck by how fragile they looked. They were tall and slender with 4 arms and chitinous plates and large multifaceted eyes. They moved with grace, but their weapons were outdated and their armor was ceremonial rather than functional. These were a people who had known peace for generations, and now they were dying because the galaxy's predators had found them. The Krath forces between Maria's squad and the Velaran defenders collapsed under the coordinated assault. Maria moved forward and met a Velaran officer whose armor was scorched and whose antennae drooped with exhaustion. Commander Thesic, the Velaran asked, and her voice translator made her words understandable. Sergeant Maria Okonkwo, Maria replied. Earth Defense Force and 3rd Expeditionary Group. This 6-4 eyes focused on Maria with intensity. Why did you come, Thesic? Asked. Your species owes us nothing. Maria checked her tactical display and saw more Krath forces approaching. We owe you everything, Maria said simply. You voted to let humanity join the galactic community when everyone else wanted us quarantined, and we remember our friends. She raised her weapon and chambered a fresh magazine. Now let's show these Krath bastards why you don't mess with Earth's allies over the next 6 hours. Maria's squad fought alongside Thesic's forces and learned to coordinate with beings whose biology and psychology were nothing like human. The Velarans were naturally cautious and preferred careful defensive positions. Humans were naturally aggressive and preferred to keep enemies off. Balanced together, they formed something more effective than either species alone. Maria taught Thesic how to use terrain for ambushes. Thesic taught Maria how to read Krath command signals. The Krath had been expecting a conventional defense and a population that would break under sustained assault. Instead, they found themselves Fighting a two-species force that adapted faster than Krath Doctrine could counter. As dawn broke over the battlefield, Maria stood beside Thesic on a ridge overlooking the contested zone. The Krath had pulled back to regroup, and human drop pods continued to rain from the sky. Thousands of human soldiers were now on Valara's surface, and more were coming. Thesic looked at Maria, and her antennae moved in what Maria had learned was a gesture of confusion. Your people fight with such ferocity, Thesic said. But you also risked your lives to save my soldiers, and I don't understand. Maria pulled off her helmet and let Thesic see her face. She was young, and her skin was dark and scarred, and her eyes held the weight of too many battles. My grandmother told me something before I enlisted. Maria said that the measure of a person isn't how they treat those who can help them, but how they treat those who can't. And humanity has made a lot of mistakes and done a lot of terrible things, but we're trying to be better. She gestured to the battlefield where human and Velaran forces were setting up defensive positions. You gave us a chance when no one else would, and that means something, and we don't abandon people who believed in us. Thesic's antennae lifted, and her mandibles clicked in what Maria was beginning to recognize as respect. Your species is very strange, Thesic said. Maria grinned. You have no idea. A massive explosion lit up the horizon, and Maria's tactical display showed a Krath command carrier going down under human orbital bombardment. The tide was turning, but the battle was far from over. Maria replaced her helmet and checked her weapon. Come on, Commander, she said. Let's go remind the Krath why evolution made humans the scary ones. Thesic picked up her own weapon and followed behind them. The sun rose over Valara and illuminated a battlefield where two species fought side by side, and above them, human ships continued to pour from the sky like avenging angels. The galaxy was about to learn something. It had forgotten Earth, remembered its promises. Commander Thesic stood in the temporary command center that human engineers had constructed in less than 3 hours, and marveled at the efficiency of these strange beings. The structure was nothing like Velaran architecture, and it was built from prefabricated panels and portable generators, and everything was designed for rapid deployment and faster abandonment. Humans built things, expecting them to be destroyed, and planned accordingly around. Her human and Velaran officers worked side by side, coordinating the planetary defense. The language barriers were slowly dissolving as translation software improved, and both species learned each other's communication patterns. Admiral Chen stood at the central holographic display, and his weathered face showed the calm determination of someone who had seen worse. Xisica had learned that Chen was 73 years old by human reckoning, and had been fighting in various conflicts for 45 of those years by Velaran standards. He should have retired to contemplative study decades ago by human standards. He was in his prime. The Krath are regrouping in orbit, Chen said, and his finger traced movements on the display. They're not used to ground forces that fight back effectively, and they're trying to decide whether to commit more troops or cut their losses. A Velaran intelligence officer named Kethris chittered nervously.
Wait.
They outnumber us 5-1, Admiral, and even with your forces, we cannot sustain a prolonged siege. Chen smiled, and it was not a comforting expression. Numbers matter less than you think, he said. And the Krath had never fought humans before, and they're about to learn some hard lessons. Thesic watched the human admiral and wondered what it was like to come from a species whose entire history was written in warfare. She had accessed the human cultural database that Chen had provided, and what she found there had disturbed her deeply. Humanity had fought wars continuously for its entire recorded history. They had fought over territory and resources and ideology and religion, and sometimes it seemed over nothing at all. They had developed weapons capable of sterilizing their entire planet, and had come terrifyingly close to using them. The Galactic community had observed Earth for centuries before making contact, and the debate had been fierce. Many species argued that humans were too dangerous and too violent and should be contained, or even eliminated before they achieved faster than light travel. Others, including Valara, had argued that humanity's capacity for violence was matched by their capacity for cooperation and creativity and compassion. Compromise had been conditional membership in defensive treaties that most species Viewed as symbolic gestures, humanity had been effectively neutered and kept at the edge of galactic civilization thesis. Remembered the debates in the Velarin Council 200 years ago. She had been young then and had voted in favor of human inclusion because she believed that judging a species by its worst moments was unjust. Now, those same humans had crossed dozens of light years to save her world. Maria Okonkwo entered the command center, and her armor was scorched and her face was smudged with combat residue. She moved with the loose confidence of someone who had just survived another battle. Sector 12 is secure, Maria reported. We've pushed the Krath back to their landing zone perimeter and Velaran forces are establishing defensive positions. Chen nodded. Casualties, 3 wounded and none dead. Maria said the Velarans took heavier losses before we coordinated properly. Desic felt a surge of shame. Her people were dying in numbers far exceeding their human allies. And it was their own world they were defending. Maria seemed to sense Desic's mood and turned to face her. Commander, your people are doing well, Maria said gently. You're not trained for this kind of warfare, and you're learning fast. We are weak. Desic said bitterly. We have had peace for so long that we forgot how to fight. Peace isn't weakness, Maria replied. It's what you're supposed to have when you've evolved past killing each other over resources. She gestured to the holographic display showing the orbital situation. Humanity never had that luxury, and Earth is a harsh world and it tried to kill us every day for millions of years, and we had to become predators just to survive. Admiral Chen joined the conversation. When humans developed agriculture and civilization, we didn't stop fighting, he said. We just fought each other instead of nature. And we got very good at it. He pulled up historical files on the display, and Disick saw images of human warfare across the centuries. Primitive clubs and spears gave way to swords, and armor gunpowder weapons evolved into automatic rifle stanks, and aircraft and missiles that could cross continents. We've fought over 10,000 major wars, Chen continued, and that's just in recorded history. And every generation of humans has known warfare, and we've studied it and refined it and made it into an art form. Why, Desic asked, why continue such violence when you could choose peace? Chen's expression grew somber. Because other humans wouldn't choose peace, he said, and because choosing peace when your enemy chooses war means extinction. Maria added her own perspective. My ancestors were taken from their homes in chains and enslaved for generations, and they survived through stubborn refusal to give up, and when they finally won their freedom, they had to fight for civil rights and dignity, and every generation of my family has had to fight for something. She met Desic's eyes. Humans don't fight because we love war, Maria said. We fight because we love what we're protecting, and we've learned that sometimes violence is the only language that predators understand. Desic thought about the Krath and their methodical destruction of peaceful civilizations. She thought about the Confederation's careful diplomatic protocols and the endless debates and the belief that reason and negotiation could solve all conflicts. The Krath had taught her that some beings only understood force. The rest of the galaxy thinks humans are barbaric. Desic said quietly. There, right? Chen replied bluntly. By galactic standards, we are barbaric, and we come from a death world, and our history is soaked in blood, and the difference is that we're honest about what we are. He zoomed the display to show the Krath fleet. The Krath are just as violent as humans. Chen said, but they hide it behind doctrine and imperial destiny and the fiction that conquest is their natural right. We see through that because we've used those same excuses ourselves. Maria checked her weapon and prepared to return to the field. The galaxy wanted us contained because we scared them. Said they put us in a corner with treaties that they never intended to honor, and they thought we'd stay there quietly. She smiled. Grimly, turns out humanity doesn't do quietly, eh? Communication alert chimed, and a Velaran technician looked up with surprise. Commander, we're receiving messages from other Confederation worlds, and they're asking about the human intervention, and some are requesting human assistance. Chen and Maria exchanged knowing looks. Word is spreading. Chen said the galaxy is realizing that humanity took treaties seriously and that we're effective fighters. They're going to want to use you, Desic said with concern. They'll see your species as weapons to be deployed. Let them try, Maria said. We don't fight for people who view us as tools, and we fight for people who treated us like equals. She looked at Desic. Valara voted for humanity when you had nothing to gain and everything to lose, And you believed we could be better than our history? And we're here because of that choice. Chen pulled up a star map showing human space and its neighbors, after this the galaxy. He's going to have to decide how they view humanity, he said. They can continue treating us like dangerous children who need supervision. He zoomed in on Valara, or they can recognize that we're exactly the kind of dangerous you want on your side. Alarms suddenly blared across the command center. Krath fleet is moving. A technician called out they're deploying additional forces. Chen studied the display, and his expression hardened. They're going all in, he said. They think numbers will overwhelm us. Maria holstered her weapon and headed for the exit. Then we'll teach them what human stubbornness looks like. Stetsik watched these strange beings prepare for battle and felt something shift in her understanding. Humanity was dangerous, but their danger came with loyalty. They were violent, but their violence was protective. They were stubborn, but their stubbornness meant they never abandoned their principles. The galaxy had tried to contain humanity because they feared what humans represented. What they represented was simple and terrifying: a species that refused to surrender, refused to abandon others, and refused to accept that might. Made Rythasik picked up her own weapon and followed Maria toward the battlefield of humans could cross. The galaxy, for a 200-year-old promise, then Valara, could fight for its own survival with equal conviction outside the command center. Drop pods continued to fall from the sky, and in orbit human ships danced between Krath dreadnoughts with terrible grace. The battle for Valara was far from over. But for the first time since the Krath arrived, Vesic believed they could win. Supreme Commander Zethrak of the Krath Imperium stared at the tactical display aboard his flagship and felt something he had not experienced in 30 campaigns, and that emotion was confusion. The holographic readout showed his forces losing ground. On Valara Prime, despite numerical superiority, his precisely calculated invasion was collapsing into chaos. Cause was apparent and infuriating. Hominstrats had reviewed the intelligence reports on this species, and everything suggested they should be insignificant. They were young and primitive and confined to a single star system by treaties that the rest of the galaxy barely remembered. Their military should have been decades behind Krath technology, yet his ground forces were being systematically destroyed by these upstart mammals. Status report, Zethrak demanded, and his translated voice carried the harsh, clicking consonants of Krath speech. His tactical officer Vren manipulated the display and showed the planetary situation. We have lost 42% of our ground forces in 6 hours, Vren reported. The humans employ tactics we have never encountered, and they coordinate with Velaran defenders in our formations. Cannot adapt quickly enough. Zethrak's mandibles ground together. In frustration, the Krath way of warfare had conquered dozens of species. They deployed overwhelming force and used superior technology, and expected enemies to recognize the futility of resistance. Most species surrendered when they calculated the mathematical certainty of defeat. Humans apparently could not do mathematics. Commit the reserve forces, Zethrak ordered. Deploy an additional 10,000 troops, and we will crush them through sheer numbers. Vren hesitated, and that moment of pause made Zethrak's eyes narrow. You question my command? No, Supreme Commander, Vren replied quickly. But I must note that human casualties remain remarkably low, and while our forces suffer heavy losses, the humans seem to be fighting more effectively. As time progresses, Zethrak dismissed this observation with a gesture. They are lucky, and luck runs out, and deploy the reserves immediately. The order went out, and Zethrak watched thousands of additional Krath soldiers board troop carriers. He would drown the humans in Krath bodies if necessary. Planetary invasions were about will and resources, and the Krath had never lost a siege on the planet's surface. Maria Okonkwo watched the Krath reinforcements descend from orbit, her tactical display painted. The incoming carriers in red showed their projected landing zones. They're committing reserves, she reported to Admiral Chen through her comlink. Looks like 10,000 additional hostiles. Chen's voice came back calm and collected. Good. And we were hoping they'd do that. Maria smiled inside her helmet. She had been briefed on the overall strategy and knew that human forces had been deliberately holding back certain capabilities. The Krath thought they understood the scope of human Military power? They were wrong. All units prepare for Phase 2. Chen's voice echoed across all human channels. Show them what Deathworlders can really do. Maria's squad was positioned in the ancient archive city of Valara, and the site was a massive complex of libraries and museums and cultural monuments. The Krath had targeted it for occupation, because destroying a species' history was an effective way to break their spirit. Maria had been ordered to hold this position, and she intended to do exactly that. The archive city was built of elegant spires and graceful arches and crystalline structures that caught sunlight and turned it into rainbows. It was beautiful and fragile and completely unlike the brutal utilitarianism of human military architecture, which made it worth defending. The Krath assault came at midday, and thousands of soldiers advanced in precise formation toward the archive. Maria's force numbered only 200 humans and perhaps 100 Velaran defenders. By any reasonable calculation, they should retreat. Humans specialized in unreasonable calculations. Let them get close, Maria ordered, and her voice was steady. Hold fire until they're committed. The Krath advanced, and their formation was textbook perfect. They moved like machines and expected resistance to crumble before their disciplined assault. Maria waited until they were within 200 meters. Then she gave the order, light them up. The archive city erupted, and coordinated fire. Human snipers took down Krath officers with precise headshots. HFY weapons teams shredded Krath formations with sustained fire. Combat engineers triggered pre-positioned charges that collapsed approach routes. The Krath advanced staggered, and their perfect formation dissolved into chaos, but they did not retreat. Krath doctrine emphasized persistence, and they pushed forward despite horrific casualties. Reached the outer buildings of the archive and began urban combat. This was where human advantages multiplied. The Krath had learned warfare on open plains where formations and firepower decided battles. Humans had perfected urban combat in the ruins of cities on Earth, where every building was a fortress and every corner was death. Maria's squad moved through the archive. Like ghosts, they used the buildings for cover and set ambushes and struck from unexpected angles. A Krath squad would clear a room and move forward, and then find humans emerging from concealed positions behind them. The psychological effect was devastating. Krath began to fear the buildings themselves, and their advance slowed to a crawl. Maria found herself defending the central archive in a building that held Valara's oldest historical records. Valaran archivist named Dazara had refused to evacuate and was still cataloging documents even as explosions rocked the structure. You need to leave, Maria told her through her translator. This building is going to become a battlefield. Sarah's antennae waved negative. These records are 3,000 years old, she said. They are irreplaceable, and I will not abandon them.
Ow.
Maria looked at the ancient texts and scrolls and digital archives. She thought about human history and how much had been lost to warfare and conquest. She thought about the Library of Alexandria and the burning of books throughout human civilization. All right, Maria said. Then we defend them together. She positioned her squad throughout the central archive and prepared for the Krath assault. The battle that followed became legendary in Human Military History 37. Human Marines held the central archive against wave after wave of Krath soldiers. They fought from room to room and floor to floor, and used every advantage the building provided. When ammunition ran low, they used Krath weapons. When positions became untenable, they fell back and set traps. Krath lost nearly 800 soldiers trying to take the central archive. They never succeeded. Krath commander finally made direct contact with Maria, and his translated voice carried fury and confusion. Why do you sacrifice yourselves for alien books? He demanded. This archive means nothing to your species. Maria was crouched behind a barricade, and her armor was scorched and her squad was down. 215 effective soldiers. She was exhausted and in pain and had not slept in 29 hours. You wouldn't understand, Maria replied, and her voice was hoarse. Explain it to me, the Krath commander said. Maria thought about how to translate human values to a being who saw other species as obstacles. We fight for the archive because burning libraries is how evil wins, she said. Because destroying history is how tyrants erase the truth, and because if we let you take this building, then we've decided that culture has no value. She adjusted her position and chambered a fresh magazine. My people made that mistake too many times in our own history, Maria continued. We burned books and destroyed art and erased entire civilizations, and we carry the shame of those actions." Her voice hardened. "Not on our watch, and not anymore, and you don't get to repeat our mistakes." The Krath commander was silent for a long moment. "You are dying for texts you cannot even read." "Yeah," Maria said, funny. "Thing about humans, and we're really stupid that way." The assault resumed, and the Krath came with renewed fury. But something had changed in their approach. They fought with anger now. Instead of cold calculation, enemies made mistakes. Maria's squad exploited every error as the sun began to set. Human reinforcements arrived. Fresh troops poured into the archive district, and the Krath found themselves surrounded. The Krath commander who had spoken with Maria was captured. Alavaz's human soldiers secured him. He looked at Maria with what translation software interpreted as confusion, mixed with something approaching respect. "Your species is insane," he said. Maria removed her helmet and let him see her face. She was young and dark-skinned, and her eyes held the weight of too many battles. Blood ran down her cheek from a cut above her eye. "Yeah," she agreed, "we get that a lot." She looked around the archive and saw Velaran and human soldiers standing together. Fessa, the archivist, was still inside and still cataloging records. "The difference between us and you," Maria said to the Krath commander, "is that we're insane in defense of things that matter, and you're just predators who pick on the weak." She signaled for the soldiers to take him away. Around the archive, the Krath offensive was collapsing. They had committed their reserves and found themselves outfought and outmaneuvered by forces that should have been overwhelmed. In orbit, Admiral Chen was coordinating the final phase. Human ships had been carefully husbanding their strength, and now they struck kinetic. Weapons launched from human vessels and simple metal rods accelerated to orbital velocities. Krath had shields against energy weapons. The sun rose over Valara Prime and painted the battlefield in shades of gold and crimson. Commander Thesic stood among the ruins of what had been the Eastern Commercial District and surveyed the cost of victory. The Krath had fled, and the invasion had been broken, but Valara bore deep scars that would take generations to heal. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble. Agricultural regions were contaminated. Orbital infrastructure that had taken centuries to build was debris floating in space, and the casualty of 6 people had lost nearly 2 million civilians and 40,000 defenders. The numbers were incomprehensible, and each digit represented a life and a family and dreams that would never be fulfilled. The human losses were proportionally even more devastating. The Earth Defense Force, 3rd Expeditionary Group, had deployed 16,000 personnel to Valara 4. 1,800 would never see Earth again. 30% casualties in less than a week of continuous combat. Thesic walked through a temporary medical station where human and Velaran wounded were being treated side by side. By side, the humans had brought advanced medical technology, but even that could not repair shattered bodies or erase. Maria Okonkwo, sitting on a supply crate, and the young sergeant's left arm was immobilized and her face was pale with exhaustion. Sergeant Thesic said gently, "You should be in a medical pod." Maria shook her head. "I'm fine, and there are people who need the pods more than I do." She looked around the medical station, and her eyes held grief that no young person should carry. "We lost Jenkins and Torres and Kowalski," she said quietly. "They were good people, and Jenkins had a kid back on Earth, and she was 3 years old, and he was supposed to go home next month." Thesic's antennae drooped in the Velaran expression of shared sorrow. "I am sorry," she said, and the words felt inadequate. "Your species sacrificed so much for us," Maria met her eyes. "That's what you do for friends, Admiral." Chen appeared, and his uniform was stained, and his weathered face showed the weight of command. "Commander Thesic," he said formally, "I need to discuss the situation." They moved to a quiet corner, and Chen pulled up a portable holographic display. "The Krath fleet has retreated beyond the system boundary," he reported. "Our scouts confirm they're continuing to fall back, and I don't think they'll return. Then we are safe," Thesic said, and felt relief wash through her. Now Chen agreed, but the galaxy is watching what happened here, and word is spreading fast. He manipulated the display and showed incoming communications from dozens of species were receiving messages from Confederation worlds and from independent systems and from species we've never heard of before. They all want the same thing. They want human protection. Thesic said, and her voice carried concern. Some Duchen said others want to know if humanity intends to replace the Krath as the next imperial power, and still others are demanding that we return to our assigned borders. He closed the display. The galaxy has to decide what humanity represents, and they're scared because we proved that we're more dangerous than they thought. Saved us, Thisic protested. How can they view that negatively? Maria spoke up from her position on the supply crate. Because power is scary no matter who holds it, and the galaxy spent centuries believing humans were contained, and now they know. We're not. Chen nodded. The question isn't whether we're dangerous, and we've proven that we are, and the question is whether we're a danger to them. He looked at Thesic. That's where you come in, Commander. Thesic felt her antennae rise in confusion. Don't understand. The Confederation Council is convening an emergency session to discuss the human intervention, Chen explained. They want testimony from Velaran leadership about what happened here. His expression grew serious. Some council members are arguing that humanity violated the terms of our conditional membership by deploying military forces without Confederation approval, and they want sanctions and restrictions, and possibly even containment protocols. Thesic felt anger rise in her chest. You saved us, and they want to punish you for it. Politics, Maria said with bitter amusement. Same everywhere, apparently. Chen pulled up another display and showed the current political alignments in the Confederation Council. You have allies, he said, species that recognize what we did and that value the principle of mutual defense. But you also have species that are terrified of what human military capability means for galactic power structures. He met Thesic's eyes. Your voice will carry weight, and Valara was the victim here, and your testimony could determine how the galaxy treats humanity going forward. Thesic looked around the medical station at wounded humans, and Valaranchi thought about Maria's squad holding the central archive against impossible odds. She thought about human drop pods falling from the sky like avenging angels. She thought about Admiral Chen's message to the Krath. What do you want me to say? Thesic asked. Chen's expression was difficult. To read the truth, he said. Simply tell them what happened, and let the council decide. You're not going to try to influence my testimony? No. Chen said, because if humanity has to manipulate the truth to be accepted, then we're no better than. The Krath. Maria stood and walked over. Despite her injuries, the galaxy will decide what they think of us based on your words. Commander, she said, if you tell them we're monsters who came for conquest, then they'll believe it. And if you tell them we're friends who honor our commitments, then maybe they'll see us differently. She smiled tiredly. Either way, we'll still be who we are, and stubborn Deathworlders who don't know when to quit. Thesic made her decision 3 days later. She stood before the Confederation Council, and the assembled representatives of 47 species watched as she prepared to speak. The chamber was vast and ancient and designed to make individuals feel small. Thesic had never been particularly political, but she understood that this moment would define not just Valara's future, but humanity's place in the galaxy. Honored representatives. She began, and her voice was amplified across the chamber. I come before you to give testimony about the human intervention. On Valara Prime, she pulled up holographic displays showing the Krath invasion. The Krath attacked my world without warning or provocation, and our defense forces were overwhelmed in hours, and our orbital infrastructure was destroyed, and our people faced extinction. The displays showed Krath atrocities. We sent distress signals to all allied systems, and no one came, and no one could reach us in time. She paused and let that sink in. Except humanity. New displays showed human ships arriving and drop pods descending. The Earth Defense Force 3rd Expeditionary Group traveled dozens of light years to honor a treaty that most of the galaxy had forgotten, and they asked for nothing in return, and they expected no reward. She showed footage of human and Velaran forces fighting side by side. They taught us how to fight, and they coordinated with our defenders, and they treated us as equals rather than victims, and when the Krath targeted our cultural monuments, the humans defended them as if they were human heritage. The display showed Maria's squad holding the central archive. Sergeant Maria Okonkwo told the Krath commander, that humanity would not allow the destruction of history and culture, and her squad lost 22 soldiers, defending texts they could not read and museums that held nothing of their own history. The sixth voice grew stronger. Humans died for us, and not because they hoped for profit or territory, and not because they sought to replace the Krath as overlords, and they died because 200 years ago, Valara voted to give humanity a chance. She looked around the chamber. Some of you argue that humanity violated their conditional membership and that they deployed military force without confederation approval, and this is technically accurate. She let that acknowledgement hang in the air. But I would ask you to consider what that argument means, and you are suggesting that humanity should have obeyed bureaucratic protocols while my people were being slaughtered, and you are suggesting that following proper channels was more important than saving lives? Her antennae rose in challenge. If that is what Confederation membership means, then I question whether Valara belongs in this body. Several representatives stirred at that statement. The sick continued. Humanity has proven three things through their intervention, and first, they honor their commitments even when convenient to ignore them, and second, they possess military capabilities that many of us underestimated, and third, they are willing to sacrifice their own people to protect others. She pulled up casualty figures. 30% of the human expeditionary force died, or was wounded on Valara, and these are not the actions of a species seeking conquest, and these are the actions of true allies. She looked directly at the council representatives who had called for human sanctions. You fear human military power, and I understand that fear, and they are dangerous, and they come from a death world, and their history is violent. She gestured to the displays showing human soldiers fighting alongside Valarans, but their danger is protective rather than predatory, and they are the kind of dangerous you want defending you, and not threatening you. Her voice grew passionate. The Krath will return, and if not to Valara, then to other worlds, and they have learned that Confederation species are vulnerable, and that our defensive treaties are symbolic rather than real. She looked at each representative.